The barrel of his flashlight hit her eyes before his words did. "License and registration," he barked, hand resting on his gun like it was part of his skin. He thought he was in control. He had no idea she could end his career before sunrise. The barrel of his flashlight hit her eyes before his words did, the harsh beam slicing through the dark and forcing her to blink. "License and registration," he barked, his voice carrying that mix of command and contempt she had heard too many times before. His hand rested lazily on the butt of his gun, the gesture casual but deliberate, like he wanted her to know it was there. The flashing red and blue lights from his cruiser strobed against the empty street, painting her skin in restless color. She didn't move at first, her fingers still wrapped around the steering wheel, her eyes locked on his face. He was tall, his features sharpened by the night, the corners of his mouth curled in a smirk that said he had already decided who she was. He had no idea she could end his career before sunrise. The night had been calm before this, the kind of stillness that makes you notice every sound, the hum of her tires on the asphalt, the faint buzz of a streetlight, the slow rhythm of her own breathing. She had been driving home from a long day. At the office, replaying details from an investigation in her mind, her badge tucked under her blazer, out of sight. She wasn't in uniform tonight. She didn't need it to do her job. When she saw the cruiser in her rearview mirror, she didn't think much of it at first. But then the lights came on, sharp and sudden, and she felt that familiar knot in her stomach, not fear exactly, but a recognition of what might be coming. She pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching against gravel. In the mirror, she watched him approach, slow and deliberate, as though every step was part of some performance. The beam of his flashlight traveled over her car before it landed squarely on her face. She kept her expression neutral, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. He leaned down, his forearm resting on the edge of her window, his shadows spilling into the car. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, the smirk still there. It wasn't a question meant to be answered. She knew better than to take the bait. "No, officer," she said evenly, her voice calm, measured. He studied her for a moment, like he was waiting for a crack in her composure. "Driving a little erratically back there," he said, drawing out the words. "You've been drinking?" She shook her head. "No, sir." The smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I take a look in the vehicle?" That wasn't a request either. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her, the way his posture, his tone, his proximity were all designed to remind her he thought he had the power here. She moved slowly, reaching for her purse on the passenger seat, keeping her hands in sight at all times. The leather strap brushed against her fingers, and she pulled it into her lap, unzipping it deliberately. Inside was her wallet, her ID, her registration, and her badge, though the last one was tucked in a way he couldn't see. Not yet. She handed him her license and registration, her eyes steady on his face. He glanced at them, his gaze flicking back to her, the smirk still in place. "Where you headed tonight?" he asked, like the answer would somehow confirm his unspoken assumptions. "Home," she replied. The word hung between them for a moment. He tapped her license against his palm, then stepped back toward his cruiser, but not before letting the flashlight beam sweep over her once more. She sat still, her hands returning to the wheel, watching him in the side mirror. He lingered at his car for longer than necessary, clearly in no rush to let her go. She could feel her heartbeat steady but firm, her mind already memorizing every detail, the way he spoke, the way he stood, the way he looked at her like she was prey and he was the hunter. When he finally returned, he leaned down again, closer this time, his voice dropping to something quieter, more pointed. "You be careful out here," he said, as if it were a warning. She gave a single nod, started the engine, and waited for him to step away. The cruiser stayed behind her for 2 full blocks before turning off down another street. She drove the rest of the way in silence, the city's quiet night closing back in around her, but her thoughts were sharp and clear. She knew men like him had seen their kind too many times in too many reports. This one thought he had gotten away with something tonight, thought he had reminded her of her place. But what he didn't know was that she wasn't done with him, not by a long shot. By the time she reached her driveway, she already knew what her first move would be when she stepped into her office tomorrow morning. The precinct was louder than usual the next morning, the sound of boots on tile and phones ringing blending into a restless hum. She stepped through the glass doors with the same unhurried stride she always had. Her black blazer fitted perfectly, her hair neatly pulled back. There was nothing about her presence that asked for attention, yet heads still turned as she passed. In her hand, she carried a slim leather folder, its contents more dangerous to some people in that building than a loaded gun. The officer from the night before sat at his desk, leaning back in his chair, laughing at something a colleague had said. He didn't look up at first, he didn't need to. She was just another suit in the building to him. But when the captain's office door opened and her voice cut through the noise, calm, steady, and carrying authority, he did look up, and the smirk he wore faltered, just a fraction. "Officer Daniels," she said, her eyes finding him instantly. "Conference room." Now the room's chatter dimmed, the air tightening like it knew a storm was moving in. Daniels stood, his expression halfway between confusion and irritation, adjusting his belt like he needed to reassert some control. Sure, he muttered, forcing a small chuckle to mask the shift in his chest. She was already walking toward the large glass-walled conference room, not waiting for him to follow because she knew he would. Inside, the blinds were drawn, shutting out the curious eyes of the bullpen. A long table stretched across the room. The captain seated at one end, 2 senior officers flanking him. She took the chair at the head opposite the captain, placing her folder neatly in front of her. Daniels sat at the far end, leaning back like he had nothing to hide. Though the slight tapping of his fingers on the table betrayed a restless edge, she opened the folder slowly, revealing a neatly organized stack of papers and a small digital recorder. "Officer Daniels," she began, her tone smooth, professional, but with an undercurrent that made it impossible to relax. "Last night, at approximately 9:47 p.m., you conducted a traffic stop on a civilian vehicle, correct?" He nodded, his shoulders angling back. "Yeah, car was driving a little erratic. Figured I should check it out." Her gaze didn't leave his face. "Any evidence of intoxication? Suspicious items? Outstanding warrants?" "No," he said quickly, then added, "But I thought so." "Nothing," she cut in, her voice still calm but firm enough to slice through the air. "No citation was issued. No official warning recorded, just a stop. Is that correct?" He shifted in his seat, glancing toward the captain as if expecting backup, but the captain's expression was unreadable. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered. She tapped the folder lightly with one finger. "Officer Daniels, what you don't seem to realize is that the civilian you stopped last night was me." The silence that followed was heavy, a dense weight pressing down on the room. His jaw tightened, his smirk gone entirely now. "You," he said, a weak attempt at disbelief. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. "Me, and while you may have thought last night was just another opportunity to flex your position, let me make something perfectly clear. I am the head of internal affairs for this department. My job is to investigate misconduct. My responsibility is to ensure that the badge is worn by those worthy of it. And after last night, Officer Daniels, I have reason to believe you are not one of them." His mouth opened, but no words came. The captain remained silent, letting the weight of her words settle like concrete. She pressed a button on the small recorder, and the room filled with the sound of his voice from the previous night, the clipped questions, the false accusations, the undertone of intimidation. She let it play just long enough for the discomfort to bloom in his expression, then switched it off. "This," she said, her voice low, "is not an isolated incident, is it?" He shook his head quickly. No, maybe I came off save it," she said, her tone sharp now. "You'll have every opportunity to speak in a formal interview. But I strongly suggest you think carefully about your answers, because we'll be reviewing your entire stops, arrest reports, body cam footage, every single file." Daniel swallowed hard, his posture shrinking just slightly. The swagger he'd worn so easily in the parking lot last night was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that the game had shifted and he was on the losing side. She gathered her papers into the folder, stood, and nodded once to the captain. "That's all for now." Without another glance at Daniels, she walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the tile in a steady, unhurried rhythm. As the door closed behind her, Daniels sat in the silence she'd left behind, the walls of the conference room suddenly feeling smaller, closer, as though they were pressing in on him. For the first time in a long time, the officer who had made a career of intimidation was tasting what it felt like to be on the receiving end, and it didn't sit well. By the end of the week, the quiet hum of the precinct had shifted into something sharper, heavier in atmosphere, thick with whispers and sidelong glances. The officers didn't need an announcement to know an investigation was underway. The signs were everywhere. Files that had sat undisturbed for years were being pulled, stacked high in manila folders on the internal affairs desks. Body cam footage requests were coming in hourly. People who never had a reason to step foot in the building before were now appearing at the front desk, escorted down hallways toward small interview rooms. In her office, she sat behind a desk covered in documents, her blazer draped over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled up, eyes scanning pages with relentless focus. Every time she found a detail that mattered, she underlined it in precise strokes of red ink. Officer Daniels's name appeared again and again, attached to traffic stops that ended in no probable cause, arrests with charges later dropped, complaints marked unsubstantiated, and reports that smelled of deliberate omission. She was methodical, starting with the most recent incidents and working her way back, each case forming another link in a chain she intended to tighten around him. The first witness that morning was a middle-aged man in a faded baseball cap, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted being pulled over late at night for failure to signal. Despite no traffic behind him, he spoke about the way Daniels had leaned on his car, the subtle threats wrapped in casual language, the implication that resisting could make things worse. She listened without interruption, her pen moving only to note specific date, location, Daniels's exact words. The man left the room with a strange mix of relief and unease, as though saying the words out loud had been both a release and a reopening of the wound. The next was a young woman barely out of her teens, who sat stiffly, eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone to burst in. Her account was worse. Daniels had followed her for 3 blocks before pulling her over, accusing her of looking nervous and hinting at taking her in unless she cooperated. By the time she left, her voice was steady, but her hands were clenched so tightly that knuckles had gone white. Every story seemed to confirm what she already suspected. Daniels didn't just abuse his authority, he thrived on it. Back at his desk in the bullpen, Daniels could feel the shift too. Conversations stopped when he entered. The casual nods from fellow officers were fewer now, replaced by tight, unreadable expressions. He told himself it was nothing, that internal affairs never found enough to stick, but the knot in his stomach wouldn't ease. That afternoon, she called him in for a formal interview. The room was bare except for a table, 4 chairs, and a small camera mounted in the corner. She sat opposite him, the captain at her side, a legal pad in front of her. "Officer Daniels, you are aware this interview is being recorded," she said, her tone all business. He nodded, leaning back with a forced grin. "Sure." She began with the night of their encounter, walking him through each moment in precise detail, never letting him sidestep. Then she moved to prior complaints, reading aloud the language from reports and asking him to explain discrepancies, how certain body cam recordings malfunctioned during key moments, how multiple stops ended with no citation and no clear reason for the initial stop. His answers grew shorter, his attempts at humor falling flat against her steady, unblinking gaze. At one point, when she read a particularly damning statement from a witness, he started to interrupt, but she raised a hand and he fell silent. "Officer Daniels," she said evenly, "patterns don't lie. And right now your record is a pattern of intimidation, false reporting, and abuse of authority. We're not talking about one bad night. We're talking about years." He shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking under his weight. For the first time he didn't meet her eyes. "You can't prove half of that," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just wrote something on her pad and moved on. By the time the interview ended, the knot in his stomach had become a solid weight outside the room. He passed a pair of officers who avoided his gaze, their conversation halting until he was gone. Back in her office, she added the interview transcript to the growing stack of evidence. It wasn't enough yet for termination, but it was close, very close, and she knew exactly where to look next. The real blow wouldn't come from paper, would come from the voices of the people who had stayed silent for too long. She picked up the phone and made a call to the community liaison, her voice calm but certain. "Tell them it's safe to talk now," she said. "Tell them we're listening." By Monday morning, the air in the precinct felt different, not just tense, but electric, charged with something none of them could quite name out loud. It started with a handful of civilians arriving at the front desk, quiet and watchful, their names already on a list in internal affairs. Then it grew. By midday, the waiting area was full, people standing shoulder to shoulder, some clutching old paperwork, others with nothing but their memories. The community liaison's efforts had worked. Word had spread that Internal Affairs was actively investigating Officer Daniels and that this time someone in the department was actually listening. She moved through the hallways with her usual calm, though inside she knew this was the turning point. Each new voice added weight to the case. In the small interview rooms, stories poured out. An elderly woman describing how Daniels had stopped her after church and accused her of theft, with no evidence. A delivery driver recalling how Daniels threatened to impound his van unless he cooperated with a vague request. A father explaining how his teenage son had been pulled from his car and searched for matching a description that no one could ever produce. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were a map of abuse, each pin in the timeline another nail in the coffin of his career. Outside the building, news vans began to arrive, their satellite dishes turning toward the sky, reporters jostling for position. A headline started running on the evening news. "Officer under investigation for misconduct." Multiple allegations surfaced. Daniels saw it on a muted TV in the break room, the scrolling text beneath his photo making his stomach twist. He'd told himself all week that Internal Affairs could dig, but they'd never find anything that would stick, not enough to ruin him. But now the story was in the open, and public opinion was turning fast. The smirks and small jokes he used to get from certain colleagues were gone. In their place were quiet stares, the kind people give when they're deciding whether to distance themselves before the ship goes under. That afternoon, she called him into her office, closing the door behind him. "Have a seat," she said, her voice even. He stayed standing. "I've got nothing to say without my union rep here," he said, trying to sound firm, but his tone wavered. She didn't argue. Instead, she slid a thick folder across her desk toward him. "These are sworn statements from 23 individuals," she said, "all describing encounters with you, all within the last 4 years. He didn't touch the folder. "They're lying," he said quickly. "All of them?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She leaned back slightly, her eyes never leaving his. This is no longer about what happens inside this department, Officer Daniels. The community knows, the media knows, and we both know there's more out there than what's in this folder. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the overhead light. He could feel the walls closing in, each inch of the space between them filled with the knowledge that his control was slipping. When he left her office, the hallway seemed narrower than before, the eyes on him sharper. In the locker room, two younger officers were whispering near the benches, their voices dropping as he entered. "Everything good?" one asked too casually. "Fine," Daniels muttered, shoving his gear into the locker, but the truth was gnawing at him. This wasn't like the other times Internal Affairs had sniffed around. This was bigger. They weren't just coming at him from inside. The outside world was now pressing in. That night, as he walked to his car in the dimly lit parking lot, he spotted a small group of people standing across the street, faces he recognized from the waiting room earlier. They didn't shout or hold signs. They just watched him, their presence saying more than words could. For the first time, he felt something he'd spent years making others feel exposed. Inside her office, she stayed late. The blinds drawn, the desk lamp casting a pool of light over her notes. She could see the case tightening, the pattern becoming undeniable. But she also knew this stage was the most dangerous. Men like Daniels didn't go down quietly. Still, she wasn't here to protect his pride. She was here to protect the people he'd hurt. She picked up her pen and began drafting the formal recommendation for suspension pending termination, her words deliberate and precise. The investigation wasn't over, but in her mind, the verdict was already clear. The precinct was unnervingly quiet the morning the decision came down. The kind of quiet that made every sound seem sharper, the click of her heels on the tile, the rustle of papers in the bullpen, the distant ring of a phone that went unanswered. She arrived with a sealed envelope in her hand, her face unreadable, her steps steady. Inside the captain's office, the department's leadership had already gathered, their expressions grim, the air heavy with the inevitability of what was about to happen. Outside, word had spread. Officers lingered in the hallways, pretending to work but keeping their eyes fixed on the closed door. Daniels sat in the far corner of the room, not slouched and smirking like before, but upright, tense, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He had been called in under the guise of a routine meeting, but the way the room was arranged told him this was anything but routine. She placed the envelope on the table between them and sat down, her gaze fixed directly on him. "Officer Daniels," she began, her voice calm but carrying enough weight to cut through the air. "Internal Affairs has concluded its investigation." She slid the envelope toward him. "You will find inside a detailed summary of our findings, including sworn witness statements, body cam analysis, and department records. The evidence demonstrates a consistent pattern of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violations of departmental policy over the course of your service." His jaw tightened, but he didn't reach for the envelope. "As of this moment," she continued, "you are suspended without pay, effective immediately. Following a mandatory disciplinary hearing, the department will proceed with termination." The words landed with the precision of a gavel strike. He shifted in his seat, eyes darting between her and the captain, searching for some sign of reprieve, but none came. "This is a setup," he said finally, his voice low but edged with desperation. "These people, they're lying to you." She didn't look away. 23 individuals, Officer Daniels, Dinos, backgrounds, neighborhoods, all telling the same kind of story. Are they all lying? Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He opened his mouth but closed it again, the weight of her words pressing down like a physical force. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but cutting. "Power is a responsibility, not a weapon. You chose to use yours as a weapon, and now you don't get to carry it anymore." The captain slid a small tray across the table. "Your badge and service weapon," he said quietly. Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over the badge, as though some part of him still believed he could talk his way out, but there was no bargaining left to do. Slowly, he unpinned the badge from his chest, the metal catching the light one last time before he set it down with a dull clink. The pistol followed, heavier in sound, the final symbol of authority slipping away. She gathered the envelope and stood, not looking at him as she walked to the door. The captain followed, leaving him alone in the room for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. When he finally emerged, the hallway was lined with officers. Some avoided his gaze, others met it briefly with unreadable expressions. No one spoke. He walked past them, each step echoing, each pair of eyes, a reminder that whatever he had been in this building, he no longer was. Outside, the late morning sun was bright, too bright, the world moving on without him. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered, faces from the waiting room, people who had told their stories, people who had waited for this day. They didn't cheer or jeer, they simply watched, a living testament to the truth that had finally been given weight. He kept his head down as he walked to his car, his shadow stretching long on the pavement. Back inside, she returned to her office, placed the envelope in a file cabinet, and locked it. The job wasn't about victories, it was about accountability, about making sure the badge was worn by those who understood its weight. She sat at her desk, the hum of the city outside her window, and reached for the next file in the stack. Another name, another story, another fight. Daniels was gone, but the work wasn't over. It never would be. And that was fine with her because she had no intention of stopping. If you felt the power of this story, make sure to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more hard-hitting stories that speak truth.